G'day and welcome back to Chalk Talks. Today we're discussing Hamon. With the commencement of the third annual Townsboro Build-Off, and one of the main parameters being that the creation of a Hamon is necessary to enter the main competition, I figured it was good time for me to do a full deep dive into the creation of Hamon, what Hamon is, and how to get the best out of your Hamon. At its core, a Hamon is literally just the delineation between the hard steel and soft steel within a sword or knife that has been heat treated to bring out a hardening line. Now, the origination of the word Hamon comes from Japanese, where they would practice the form of yakiire, which is clay hardening, on things like katana and wakizashi and tanto, to create this beautiful wavy pattern. But at its very core, it is literally just a grain representation of pearlite as it mixes with ferrite and martensite. With that in mind, Hamon come in very many different forms. Now, the most common that we see, the most popular of them, is this one, which presents all of the different aspects that can be had on a Hamon. Sometimes, less commonly, but still, especially in the Western sphere, we tend to see a lot of Hamon that look like this. And then we have also, in Japan and elsewhere, Hamon or hardening lines that look like this. All of these three styles, if you like, of Hamon represent exactly the same thing. That line, whether it be straight or curved, whether it be hard or whether it be soft, denotes the line between soft and hard in the steel. And this is represented purely by the nature of steel. And I have a whole video on what martensite and what ferrite and what austenite are. But for the basis of this explanation, martensite, the hard form of steel, and ferrite, the soft form of steel, when commingled and when in the in-between phase in austenite, can form something called pearlite. And that's what normally creates that line in the steel. It is literally just a delineation where ferrite is transforming into martensite, but hasn't quite yet. And so there's a mixture of ferrite and cementite and all that kind of stuff in the line. And that's why you'll see, even on the very hard-lined Hamon after etching, you will see this almost sprinkle dotted like thing above the hardening line in the soft steel. And that is actually the gradient where you've gone from true hard steel into the softer material. It is not like a hard line. In some instances, like with this bottom depiction, you can get a very, very hard line, but even with those, that line is diffused along a longer period than you would think. It's not just a like minute two-dimensional line, if you like. And so, depending on the speed at which you quench, that line can be wider or shallower. It also depends on the alloy, and we'll get to that in a minute. Now, I'm not doing a Japanese terminology lesson, but the little squiggly lines that come down towards your edge, normally referred to as ghosts on your blade, are known as ashi in Japanese. And ashi are literally just the same, but in reverse. So where you have martensite formation, carbide formation above the hardening line that create these little freckles, the ashi are ferrite matrices inside the martensite. So it is leftover pearlite and ferrite traveling down into the edge. The reason that ashi were originally developed, according to what little research I could find on Japanese sword, was that it provided extra strength to a fairly hard and brittle material. Because you have long lines of slightly softer material, it then supports the edge a little bit better. To be honest, I think it's more just about looks. It just looks really cool when you have these ghostly waves of this unhardenable material, unhardened material coming down towards your edge. And that's why in the West, we see a lot of these. which is where we have a hardening line, a recognizable hardening line, but it tends to be very washy and there's not a lot of ashy going on. There's not a hard line denoting where the Hamon starts. And it also doesn't have that freckling like we normally would, because in actual fact, the hardening line is in the middle of this wash. Then you've got the really hard line, and this is normally done by differential hardening, by quenching in a thin pan or something very shallow and only dipping the edge. And that's why you get that very hard transition line. That hard transition line, again, is still going to have that softness to it. It is still going to have some of that carbide coming out in that line, but that is going to be your hardest transition compared to any other form of Hamon. Now, when it comes to making a beautiful Hamon, we're normally aiming for this, but these can be equally as beautiful, and I'll show you how to get all three in this video. So when it comes time to make your Hamon, you're going to want to have the right kind of steel. And this is something that's been understood throughout the years of discovering the various ways you can make Hamon and make it more beautiful, more visually pleasing. But at the end of the day, because of the nature of steel, there are certain elements that you're going to want to look for in your knife material that you want for making the best Hamon. And I think there's a few misconceptions surrounding Hamon and how they develop that then lends itself to why you choose the wrong steel. The first steel that most people will tell you about is something like W1 or W2. Those are the most commonly talked about in Hamon circles, but they don't tell you why. And the main reason that specific steel choices are important is because of something called shallow hardening. The key difference between shallow and deep hardening steels is purely the depth at which they harden when quenched in large cross-sections. Metallurgical scientists will take an inch round cross-section or bar of a specific alloy and quench it in a very controlled media. Whatever that media is, they will use the same media for all of the steels that they are testing. And the depth at which martensite forms across the cross-section of that 1 inch round in that media will then determine whether or not it is a shallow or deep hardening steel. The main reason that shallow hardening steels are the way they are is because of low alloy. Alloying contents in the steel will then precipitate more martensite than without it. We all know that steel is a mixture of carbon and iron, but in certain levels, alloying contents such as vanadium and chromium and things like manganese can increase the hardenability or the depth of hardenability of a steel. It does this by attracting carbon molecules. So in the iron, in the steel, there is a natural connection between the iron and the carbon, but that is a very loose connection. As we know, you can burn out carbon if you over-oxidize your steel. With the addition of alloying contents, that carbon then has something else to attach to. And in a conversation I had about hypereutectoid steels in a previous video, we know that that can form carbide. So carbide segregation happens due to high alloy content. That precipitation of carbides can also occur in depth in the material. And so the lower the speed of quench needed, the deeper the hardening. This is why stainless steels technically can't get a Hamon. There are specific stainless steels that can, and I know there will be people who get in the comment section and tell me that they can, but for the most part, stainless steels cannot get a Hamon. So the reason for that is because of the high chromium levels, which cause carbide precipitation. But if we want to get a shallow hardening steel, what we don't need is a hypereutectoid steel. What we do need is a low alloy steel. So with this in mind, let's talk about some ideal alloys. The ideal makeup of a steel for Hamon, being that it has low alloy, means that you have a fairly limited selection of steels to work with, but there's actually more than you might think. So we have three categories here, and in the ideal category are the standards that everyone knows, W1 and W2. Now, W1 and W2 are both hyper-eutectoid steels. That means they are incredibly finicky in the heat treat, and they are much more prone to cracking in high temperature and high speed quenches than everything else. But they do get the most activity. Of the two, W1 has the lowest alloy. W2 has a very small amount of vanadium in it, which can increase the speed at which, the depth at which it hardens. Then we have the 10 series steels. Now, most people will know at this point that 10 series steels are simple carbon steels, with the exception of one, which we'll get to in a second. But the 10 series steels are pretty much the guaranteed ideal for Hamon making in general. The best of them all is 1070 or 1060. Contrary to popular belief, you do not need to be super high carbon in order to get an appreciable Hamon. In most cases, katana and wakizashi and tanto of the Japanese historical tradition are around 0.6 to 0.7% carbon by the time that they are made into blades. When they are brought out as raw tamahagane, they are normally around 1.2 to 1.4% carbon, and then during the folding process, one of the things that they do is homogenize the carbon mixture throughout, because obviously it's patches of carbon steel amongst other things. The other thing that they do is burn out a lot of the carbon during that folding, because they get to very, very high temperatures and it's got a very small surface area. So the 10 series steels, 1060, 1070, 1075 being basically perfect, other than the fact that with the lower eutectoid, it means that it doesn't quite have some of the activity you can get out of things like 1095. Now, 1095 is pretty much the simple high carbon equivalent of the third ideal, which is Japanese white paper steel made by Takefu, and I believe Hitachi used to make it as well. Now they're Hikoki, I'm not sure if they still make it. But if you can get your hands on white paper, then that's basically the industry standard for Hamon making. But the majority of us are going to be able to access 1095 or W1 as our ideal Hamon making steel. But if I was to make something larger, something like a Bowie knife, I might go for something like 1075 if I can find it in the applicable sizes. Now, of course, not everyone has access to known steels. Not everyone can afford to buy a bar of known steel. Where can you find this in scrap? Most files, now I say that most high quality files from places like Nicholson Wheelchair and places like that will be a version of W1, W2, or 1095. There will be a high carbon, shallow hardening steel, specifically because files need to be shallow hardening in order to maintain toughness at the high hardnesses, because they do not harden all the way through the thickness of the steel. So your best bet, if you want to make a good Hamon in your steel with ashi, when we're talking about like high activity Hamon, then you want to go with files. But otherwise, try and purchase steel from a distributor that actually makes this stuff. In the acceptable category, why I say acceptable and not ideal or anything like that is because you can create Hamon in these steels, but they will not be high activity Hamon. You won't get the beautiful, flowy, ghostly ashi that you'll see in things like katana and stuff like that, and in the very, very well-made knives by people like Glenn from GC Custom Knives. In this category, you will be able to create a hardening line that will have some activity, it will have some waviness, it will have some kind of, it's some kind of activity, some kind of interest, but it won't be as active as your simple carbon steels. And the first one off the list is something that a lot of people have asked me about is 1084. 1084 is a high manganese steel. It has a lot of manganese in it, and it does not take a good Hamon. It does take a Hamon, and I have made Hamon in 1084. I have a blade with Hamon in 1084, and it has some activity, but not a lot, because the manganese content and that little bit of extra alloy content in the 1084, modern 1084, a lot of the older stuff apparently was lower carbon, lower alloy, but modern 1084 does not take a Hamon that well. 5160 and Sub 9. This one surprises some people because it is a chromium steel. And the big thing is that it won't take a high activity Hamon, but it will take a nice straight Hamon. If you want to do a clean line Hamon, if you want to do a differential etch Hamon or a differential quench Hamon, then you'll actually get a pretty decent one out of 5160 if you work the grain correctly. If the grain is nice and small and you get really good heat treat on it, you will get a decent Hamon out of 5160, especially if you do a interrupted quench and you do only an edge quench rather than doing the clay. The last one is 01 and 02. Again, high chromium, high vanadium, not high, but high for our purposes. They will not take a high activity Hamon, but they will take a Hamon. They will actually take that hardening line. And I have successfully made a decent activity Hamon in 01. So that is another one you can look at. So again, for scrapper, springs, leaf springs, will make a decent straight line Hamon. They won't make a high activity one. That is, just remind yourself of that, because the vanadium will cease any kind of activity. And the chromium, I should say. And in the bad category is all of the chromium. So all of our chrome vanadium steels, so 80 CRV2, any kind of CRV steel for like chisel making and stuff like that is not going to take a Hamon. Same with 52100. 52100 bearing steel will take a straight line Hamon, much like 5160, but again, will not have the activity, and it won't even have the activity of 5160 because it's got a lot more chromium than 5160 does. And anything that is stainless, it has way too much chromium. The depth of heat treatment and the heat treatment requirements for stainless, because you have to soak it at temperature, means that you will not achieve a Hamon in stainless. I know that there are a couple of stainlesses that are technically on the border and you might be able to pull it off, but you will not pull off any kind of activity in a stainless. If you want a decent Hamon, these are the steels you go to. At last, we finally get to the making of Hamon. How do we make a Hamon? And it comes down to three main points. And it comes down to three main points in a lot of cases when it comes to heat treatment, but in Hamon specifically, it comes down to time, temperature, and mass. And mass being the most specifically important one. The time at which it takes to get to temperature and get away from temperature is the biggest thing. With shallow hardening steels, they do not like to soak at temperature. This is why stainlesses are really bad for Hamon, because they require 5-minute, 15-minute, 20-minute periods at temperature to dissolve the carbon and chromium into the mix so that they can then harden all the way through. The other thing is, of course, is that stainlesses require a relatively slow quench, air quenching, plate quenching, that kind of thing. In the case of Hamon, you want a very quick quench because you want to go very quickly up to temperature and then very quickly away from temperature. Because what we're trying to avoid is grain growth, because the smaller the grain, the better defined our Hamon line is going to be. Because, again, we're trying to see the grain. All we're seeing when we etch the steel is we're seeing the variation in grain between ferrite, pearlite, and martensite. So therefore, the finer the grain, the better the Hamon. So the time at temperature is going to be really important. Getting it up to temperature, only to temperature, and then quickly quenched into something medium that actually quenches it quickly. Like water, like brine, or like high-speed oil. You're only going to get Hamon out of those. You can get Hamon out of a medium speed oil like canola oil, but it will be a very low activity because it's slower than the Hamon needs to develop. Remember, you're trying to freeze things basically at the very moment that they're at critical temperature. Temperature is also really important. We know from heat treatment that getting to critical temperature, staying at critical temperature, and then quenching from critical temperature is the most important thing. But in the case of high carbon and low alloy steels, the temperature becomes vastly more important. The reason for that is that grain growth exponentially increases for every degree you go above critical and every second you stay above critical. So therefore, you want to get to critical and then cool it quickly. And when I say cool it quickly, we don't need to get it down to room temperature quickly. What we need to do is get it past the martensite nose. We need to get it past the point at which martensite starts to form really quickly. And so that's why we use things like Parks 50 or Horton's K or water. And this is why the Japanese quench in water. Now, they preheat their water. You should preheat your oil and your water if you're going to do a water quench. But the speed at which you bring that temperature down is going to affect how well your Hamon develops. The last point is the most important, and that is mass. Now, you can futz with everything else, and you will end up with somewhat of an okay Hamon, but mass is what's really going to trip you up. And this is why we end up using clay in order to create Hamon. When you quench with clay on the spine, the clay is not protecting the steel from the heat. What it is doing is containing the heat. Some people believe that it's actually insulating against the water or the quench media. That's not entirely the case. What it is doing is retaining heat in the spine long enough that the edge cools really quickly and the spine doesn't cool as quickly. What it's doing is just adding thermal mass. And the reason we know this is because you can create auto Hamon, right? So you can create Hamon without using clay, without using any form of other mass increasing object. All you need to do is use time and temperature to create Hamon. You can do that through the means of an interrupted quench, and that only works if you have sufficient mass in the spine. The means by which you do that is to heat the whole blade critical, quench it into your meter very quickly, pull it out while it's still glowing, and then push it back in and out again and out in again. And the reason you do that is because you're trying to slow the speed at which the large mass, the thicker area of the spine, cools down. Because we're trying to quickly quench the areas that we want to transform into martensite, and we're trying to slow down the points at which the other parts cool. So mass is your biggest ally. So therefore, with a high mass in the spine, you can get a decent Hamon without much worry about time and temperature. With bigger knives, with larger, thicker material like katana and stuff like that, you are talking about adding a third or a half the extra width of your blade. And let's demonstrate that now. No matter the cross-section of your blade, you're going to want to end up with about a third or half the width of your material on the outside of your blade. You don't want more than that because you're not trying to over-create mass, because the more mass you create, the more heat you contain. Now remember, this is only here to protect this portion of the blade. We want this portion to harden. We want to end up with a hardening line along here, and again along here. That cannot happen if there is excess mass up around here, because what happens is that this extra heat bleeds down into the edge. So what we really need is to make sure that our thickness is increasing the mass by 2 times or 1 2/3 times rather than 3 times. You don't want the full thickness of this on either side, and you don't want more than half. You don't want about 75% because then you'd be 2.5 times larger. The same goes with a blade like this. And as you get down, even if you were to bring this down, you would want to thin your clay down towards the edge. And the reason for that, again, is because you're not trying to contain too much mass that you end up bleeding heat back into the edge, because that will ruin your ashi, that will ruin everything that you've been trying to do to get a Hamon. With really thin kitchen knives and stuff like that, you can use a very thin coating of clay, because clay holds a lot more thermal mass than steel does, funnily enough. So when making your clay, make sure that you're only using a third or at maximum half the width of your blade steel on either side, because you don't need that much in order to maintain that nice Hamon. Before we get on to the application of clay and how you would use the clay, I wanted to make sure that you understand the best way to prepare your blade for making Hamon. In the standard sense, you want to have a very clean blade. And when I say clean, I don't just mean clean as in degreased and ready for clay application, but you want it to be clean as in well ground, proportionate. So you want it to be all of the proportions in the right place. If you have squiggly lines everywhere, if you have various thicknesses in your blade, that will affect the Hamon. Remember, mass being your main enemy. If you have large sections of edge and small sections of edge, then the larger sections are going to hold on to more heat than the small sections, and they're going to cool unevenly. And this is true of even when you're heat treating a normal blade, but in Hamon it's specifically really, really important to get everything nice and clean and right. And I normally pre-grind to 120 grit so that I have a nice clean surface to adhere to with the clay. The other thing is, the thinner your blade is when you go to heat treat, the more effective your clay will be. And this comes down to mass again. You're applying mass with the clay, and so therefore the thinner you are with your steel, the faster the areas that are going to harden effectively. So therefore they're going to capture that Hamon better than if they were thicker, because the thicker they are, the more mass they have, the more heat they have, the slower they quench. So that being said, of course, the thinner you get, the more likely you are to get ripples in your edge or cracks. So it is a bit of a balancing game. My basic rule is to grind about 75% to finish before applying my clay, before doing my heat treat. It's a little riskier, but you get a much better reward in your Hamon. I discussed the idea that you can create a Hamon without clay, but the majority of you, or the majority of people in general, are probably going to approach Hamon with clay, and that's because it's the most controllable and the most repeatable way to create Hamon. When you apply clay, and in this instance I've hastily drawn a katana, you will normally lay on your first layer being the wavy swept line, whatever line you want the intentional Hamon to be. The actual Hamon, the hardening line, this is going to be your layout. And it pays to remember that whatever you do to this side, you have to do to the other side, right? Because you're trying to create an equal pattern. If you have these waves this way here, but then the waves on the other side are actually in between these, then that will completely wash out your Hamon and you'll end up with a straight line. So if it waves here, it has to wave on the other side as well. The same is not true of ashi. When applying ashi lines, you actually apply a very thin line of clay, and I'm going to use my chalk to represent it, away from the edge. You can apply ashi in any way you like. You can use dots, you can use lines, but in most cases it does not have to be measured, because when the ashi are applied, and they go almost to the edge, you don't have to go all the way to the edge, but they are very, very thin, and they're not the same thickness as your main clay. They are normally only a quarter the thickness of your blade width, if not less. The main thing about the ashi is that they are trying to draw just a little bit of that Hamon down into the edge. They are trying to draw that perlite down into your martensite. And that is achieved by having these nice thin lines. And the reason that you don't have to match this on both sides exactly is because these are incidental amounts of clay. They're not huge amounts of clay. Now, with the main clay, obviously, given that it is the main thermal mass, it has to match. And if you match the ashi, then you're going to get a better ashi than you would if they just kind of haphazardly placed. But either way, you'll get a better ashi if you have a nice hard line Hamon that is then able to bleed into those clay lines. One thing that I've found really helps with applying clay to a blade is to apply a layer of slip first. Now, slip is purely a thin piece of, thin amount of clay. So it is just clay with lots and lots of water, very basically 1 grain of clay thick, plastered on the thing. You want to degrease incredibly well, and then I normally rub the blade with the slip, and that actually cleans off any other oils that you might have. You'll then let that slip dry, that very, very thin layer of clay dry over the whole lot, and that's when you apply your clay to the spine and to your ashi, and that will help it all adhere. Another thing to be mindful of when making Hamon is what clay to use. Now, in the West, we mostly use a version of Satanite, which is a very high temperature refractory wash. It's not really a refractory cement, but it can be used as thus. But it is a very thin, very fine powder clay that is designed for high temperature use. In Japan, they use tonoko, which is a form of fire clay, but it is basically a version of terracotta. It is a very simple ground clay that is basically a fine mesh. So it is possible to use a fired clay like pottery clay, as long as it's not been fired, obviously. But for the best results, you should mix 1 part charcoal or ground, like really finely ground charcoal, to 4 parts of your clay in order to increase the thermal efficiency of the clay. Because we're using it in this format and not making pottery out of it, obviously. I have also used things like fireplace mortar. There is a local equivalent, which is in our local hardware stores, which is Lanco 156, which is just a brick and mortar for making fireplaces, and putting together fire bricks to make like brick ovens for like pizza ovens. And the last one that I have seen used but haven't used myself is things like gun gum, which is normally a refractory, sort of refractory sludge mixed with fibrous material, normally like a ceramic fiber like isowool. And that is probably my least favorite because it has the ceramic fibers in it. It's not easily laid onto the blade, and it tends to lay on very thick, because remember, we don't really want a very thick layer of stuff. This stuff also tends to swell up when heated, and I think that's by design, because I think it's an insulatory refractory rather than actually a refractory mortar or cement. And so therefore it's not ideal, and so I wouldn't suggest it, but it will work. Any kind of refractory material will work, but the 3 top ones are those. You've applied your clay, you have your ashy lines cut in, everything is ready. What do you do now? Let the clay dry. Make sure that the clay is entirely dry before you start heating it up. Thermal expansion is a thing, and water steams off really fast. What'll end up happening is you will end up popping the clay off the sides of your blade before you even get it in the forge. So let the clay dry naturally, in light if you want to. It may crack. If it cracks, fill the cracks with more clay. Don't worry about it if it cracks, unless it cracks and falls off, in which case you may have to reapply. Now, I have in the past, in my haste, dried it over the top of the forge. I will either hang it above the forge, or I will place it above the forge if I've got a charcoal forge a long way away, so that it's in the warm air, but it's not anywhere near the fire. That can work. Of course, the faster you dry, the faster you may crack it. So just be careful when drying your clay. But normally the sound rule is to leave it 24 hours to dry. Once it's dried, you're ready to heat treat. And you do this exactly as you would any other time. You get it up to temperature, and then you go into your quench media. You leave it in the quench media. If you're using clay, you put it in and you leave it there until the bubbles stop, just like you're drowning someone, as my friend Alex would say. But what should happen is that it should harden without popping the clay off. If the clay does pop off, that is not necessarily a bad sign. The clay can pop off during the heat treatment, or hopefully it pops off after the Hamon has set in. If it doesn't, you will know once you get to the grinding stage, because you won't see the Hamon anymore. But if you do have a successful Hamon quench and the clay is still on there, please scrape it off before you temper. There are a couple of reasons for this. A, if you're quenching in oil, the clay will hang on to that oil like it's thirsty for it, and it will burn and it will stink and it'll be horrible. And also it creates extra thermal mass, and the problem with that is that it means that the temper may not actually find the depth it needs if you don't use like a full 2-hour cycle. So basically, hardening is as simple as anything else. You just have to be a little bit more aware of the clay. If you've done your claying properly, you can quench using a charcoal forge, as the Japanese do. And the clay should be able to stand up to you running it through the coals. You don't want to ram it into things, but majority of the time, if you've done your claying properly and it is properly adhered, then it shouldn't knock off unless you hit it relatively hard. It's well known of the Japanese blades that they curve when quenched. Now, not all of the curvature is from the quench in katana. A lot of the time, the smiths will select their curve before they quench because they're very aware of how it reacts. But because we are creating a hardened edge and a soft spine, the soft spine is going to want to return to its natural state when hardened, right? Because as steel is heated, it expands. So as it cools, it will contract. But because we have formed austenite when heating, and then formed crystalline martensite when hardening, the crystalline structure of the hardened steel no longer wants to go back into shape. So what will it do? It will stay as it is and be pulled rearward by the soft spine. And that's why you end up with sori, or curve. Now, there are a couple of things you can do to fix this or to avoid it. One is to pre-curve, which is almost impossible to judge well unless you've practiced it and you know exactly what you're doing. The other is to just accept it. If your blade is short and wide enough, then there will be no sori. But in the event you don't want it, there is a really easy solution. Don't clay your spine. And when I say that, if I am talking about the cross-section of a knife blade, let's just say this is your knife blade, instead of applying the clay like this, we instead apply like this. That is all that is needed. As long as the spine, the absolute back of your blade, is accessible to the quench media, whatever quench media you're using, you will end up with a straight blade because there will be a hardened portion along the spine of your knife. Now, this may create a counter Hamon, which means that the Hamon may creep down the edge of the spine of your knife, but that is not as likely as you'd think, and it will stop any sori. Which is why if you want sori in a katana, you need to have the clay encompass the entire spine. Now, in a Bowie knife blade or anything big and wide like that, it is unlikely to create any kind of curvature. What you may instead interact with is counter curvature, because if you're quenching in oil, the construction of martensite may freeze in its contracted state rather than its expanded state. And in which case, as the martensite crystallizes and expands, it may end up giving you counter curve. So instead of a katana that is like that, you'll get a katana that is like this. And I know the comments I am going to see are going to be great. But in the event you end up with counter curve like this, then the only way to fix that is to reheat treat, to reforge, to reheat treat, to straighten it out before you do another quench. And you obviously have to do your normalization cycles before you do that again. But counter curvature happens a lot in oil quenches, especially with long, narrow blades. This is why the Japanese tend to use water, is because they're trying to create that curvature. So just be aware of that if you are going to use a high-speed oil, that you may get counter curvature, which not always a serious amount, but I have seen some buoys look like Persian fighters by the end of their quench. So just be aware that that's a possibility. Before we get to the subject of polishing, I figured I would cover quickly the subject of tempering. There is this myth that katana were not tempered at all after heat treat because the soft spine meant that it would support the hardened edge. This is tacitly untrue. At the end of the day, all katana were tempered, and they were tempered using the traditional Japanese method of splashing droplets of water on the blade until the droplets would no longer adhere to the surface, but it would instead bounce and skitter off using the Leidenfrost effect. Now, in our case, we can temper as we would normally would with any other blade. You can temper it in the oven, 200 degrees Celsius, 180 degrees Celsius, whatever that is in Fahrenheit, 350, 400 Fahrenheit for 2 hours, like you would any other time. The difference is in straightening. Because you don't have a hardened piece, once you've done your first temper cycle, you no longer need to use shimmed tempering or anything like that. you can lightly beat the blade with a brass hammer or even a wooden hammer, very gently, not aggressively. But because the spine section is softened, it will actually bend and straighten on its own. So you may not need to use a 3-point straightening jig or anything like that, because you'll be able to straighten freehand at the anvil after your first temporary cycle. Do not try it right after Quench, please. But yeah, temper first, and then you can beat the blade straight, rather than having to go to a 3-point temporary jig or anything like that, and potentially snapping your blade in half. Once you've hardened and tempered your blade, obviously you'll need to grind and polish it. Now, grinding can be done as normal. You can grind it with whatever abrasives you have, whatever means of grinding you have. Obviously, the hardened steel is not going to be easy to file, but whatever methods you have, if it's stones or if it's a belt grinder, you can use it. The higher grit you go to, the easier it's going to be to get to the next step, polishing. Polishing does not need to be done with stones. You can do it with stones, but it can be done with sandpaper, just like you would normally hand sand a blade. When making Hamon, one of the things to understand is that a polished surface will not show a Hamon well. When I say polished, I mean buffed. Anything that is mechanical in buffing nature, anything that uses a compound on a soft cloth or a soft belt or anything like that, or a Scotch-Brite, is going to wash out your Hamon. It is going to smear the surface of the blade. It's going to completely cover that Hamon. Because remember, you're trying to see the grain, and the grain cannot be seen through a smeared surface, which is what buffing does. It smears everything over. So, in order to polish Hamon correctly, you need hand sand. It doesn't have to be to 3,000 grit, 10,000 grit, whatever you want. It can be, and traditionally they would be taken anywhere up to about 10,000 to 15,000 grit on natural stones. But at the very basis, you want to get it to at least maybe 800 grit for your etching cycles if you want to do a modern etch. If you're doing a traditional etch, you'll want to go to more like 2,500 to 3,000 grit. I normally go to about 2,500 grit before I go to my etching cycles. Finally, you've polished your blade and it's at a beautiful 2,500 grit hand sanded finish with perfectly smooth lines. Where do you go from now? Well, the main answer is etching, because the Hamon will not show itself in a standard hand sanded finish. You will be able to see it in certain light, but it won't really pop out until you etch it. And there are several different methods you can use. Starting from the top is ferric chloride. It is the standard for all knife makers around the world to etch Damascus with and etch Hamon. It is very effective, it is very fast, but it is also very aggressive. It will show every little grain in your steel, which means that if you have some form of alloy banding, if it's W2 or W1, then you'll probably get a lot of flex in your Hamon. It won't be very clean looking, it'll be very rugged looking. But the other thing that ferric chloride does is it darkens the martensitic portion and leaves the unhardened portion gray. So it can give you a really nice contrast, especially if you're doing just a straight line Hamon. It's a really nice way to accentuate that Hamon. The other one is hydrochloric acid. Again, very aggressive, not as aggressive as ferric chloride, funnily enough, but what it doesn't do is create that juxtaposition between martensite and ferrite. It will end up with just gray with the Hamon, but it will create a more satiny color than a polished finish. My favorite, and the one that I go to normally, is a sequential etch of lemon juice and then vinegar and back and forth. I don't use a mix of the two because the two different acids, both acetic and citrus acids, attack the steel in very different ways. The vinegar darkens the steel slightly, and the lemon juice lightens the perlite, so it really brings out that natural Hamon. But it is a very iterative and long and monotonous process, because you have to do it multiple times over, maybe an hour, 2 hours of reapplying and reapplying, which can be very tedious. So I understand it's not everyone's choice, but it is my favorite. And the last one is somewhat traditional. I don't know the exact makeup of the whitening compound that Japanese swordsmiths use, but I understand and have tried and trialed and am still trialing different mixtures, but I know the two main ingredients are clove oil and iron oxide, specifically red iron oxide. And I know this for a fact because I've spoken to a couple of people who've been to Japan and spoken to Japanese swordsmiths. Now, clove oil is mildly acidic, and it makes sense that that would affect the way that the steel reacts. But also, the clove oil binds the rust, and the rust, given that it's iron oxide, is slightly harder than the steel, only just, and acts as a mild abrasive, and affects the way that the whitening, the pearlite, in the Hamon actually is seen. And what they would do is rub it in quite aggressively, and it's very, very finely powdered. It's normally applied through rice cloth. So that is something that I want to try a little bit more, and it is a more traditional approach. I do believe, and I haven't got evidence of it for it, but I do believe that they use some form of citric acid mixed in with their clove oil to create that whitening effect, but that is how most katana are whitened. People say that katana Hamon are only there through polishing. Not entirely true. There is specifically, in some cases, the Yuzuya stone is used to polish certain segments of the Hamon to create an artificial ashi. So they actually use the stone lightly in areas to create that ghost-like effect because the Hamon itself, the quench itself, did not go to plan. So there are people who do polish in, and this is traditional, polish in parts of their Hamon. So don't be afraid to try that as well. During and after your etching process, you're going to darken the blade. And there are many ways to then repolish the blade because obviously as you're etching, you are creating oxides and you have to remove those oxides. One of my favorite things that I've seen recently that I have yet to try but have seen used to great effect was an eraser, just a normal pencil eraser used on the blade in small circles to remove oxides. I'm not sure how effective it is, and I haven't tried it for myself, so I'm not recommending it here on my list, but it is an option. What I normally use is Autosol, an Autosol polish, or any kind of polish compound, polish paste, between my etch cycles of lemon and vinegar in order to clean the surface, clear the surface for the next etching cycle. And then at the very end, I use it as a polishing compound with a piece of cloth on the tip of my finger, and I just use that to final polish the knife. You can also use something like a block of rubber or a piece of steel with a piece of leather attached, much like a leather stropping compound or a leather strop. You can use that to polish a blade, but obviously you've got to be careful not to cut into the leather with the edge of your blade. And that's the same for all of these. So you can use Mother's Mag, which is another popular polishing compound I'm aware of, Autosol, paste compounds. You can buy diamond wax compounds from eBay and stuff like that, relatively cheap. There are various polishing compounds out there, but you want to go for a very, very gentle polish. And if you're going for a diamond paste compound, you want to go for a very high micron because you're not actually trying to cut the surface, you're just trying to polish away oxides. And then the last is Alox, is aluminium oxide. You can actually buy it in powder form. You can also buy silicon carbide powder in very high grits, very high mesh. A lot of the time it's used as tumbling media. So you can buy incredibly fine mesh, 6,000, 10,000 grit mesh, that you can then use with a little bit of oil or a little bit of water and applied to a piece of leather or a piece of cloth as your polishing compound. I've seen it used before and I actually kind of want to try it myself. So when you finally polish your knife, you want to polish it with the highest grit you can, and you want to polish again like you were hand sanding it straight along the blade to create that final finish and leave that beautifully etched Hamon standing out on your knife. There you have it. A little bit of a deep dive into Hamon. And I know there are a million different ways that you can polish Hamon and you can bring out Hamon, and there are various ways that you can go after it in other accounts. But I figured this was a really good starter place for anyone who hasn't attempted Hamon, or maybe who has only attempted once or twice. This is a really good place to start. I want to see you guys getting out there and challenging yourself, because there are so many different ways you can apply these techniques to create a new and exciting element to your knife. Now, with that being said, I would like to say a huge thank you for watching, and I hope you really enjoyed this, and I hope it was educational. If you did enjoy it, please feel free to leave a comment down below and hit that like button down while you're down there. And if you're not subscribed to the channel already, feel free to subscribe and hit the notification bell icon to be notified of when I upload new videos. I'm hoping to put out more content very soon. I'd like to say a huge thank you to my patrons who make this kind of content possible and have kept the lights on and kept the hammer in my hand and kept the gas in my forge for going on a couple of years now. These guys are absolutely amazing. I would not be here without them, and I have to say a huge thank you to each and every one of them individually one day. With that being said, if you'd like to join their ranks, the link is down in the description below, or it'll be in the end card of this video. I hope you have a fantastic week. Be safe, don't do anything I wouldn't do, and if you do, make sure to catch it on film. I'll see you next time.